see that you all are, I mean, we are very much on the same page. And I will be talking to you about Sylvia Plath today. Incidentally, what Mohini said is right. Sylvia Plath was not on the syllabus of any university when we were students. And I think Mohini and I are about the same, we are contemporaries. We must have done our graduation and post-graduation at the same time. But, but after I did my PhD, and while I was doing my PhD on Sylvia Plath, yes, I realized that there are a lot of people working on her because, well, she was a young poet who committed suicide tragically, and she did not write, she had not written too much, so there wasn't much of a body of work. So people who wanted a shortcut, I must admit, people who wanted a shortcut and wanted to do a quickie, so they turned to Sylvia Plath, but then they got hooked on to her. And I must warn you that reading Sylvia Plath is not the happiest of activities. I did my PhD, let me see, in 1979, 80. Yeah, 80. 80 I submitted my thesis. 81 I submitted my thesis. And after that, I did bring out a book, say about end of somewhere in the 90s. After that, I did not look back at Sylvia Plath because she can have a negative impact on people who are more sensitive than others. I remember a friend of mine borrowed a book from me. She borrowed her novel, The Bell Jar, and she went into depression and she had to take antidepressants and so on. However, when I was doing my PhD, I took it as a challenge that, okay, here is a poet who looks at the darker side of life, and I am not going to get depressed with it. I made up my mind then. And I was younger then. This time, when I started reading Sylvia Plath again, I was not so strong. And frankly, today and yesterday has been, it's one of been, it's, you have highs and lows. So it's been a low period because, Sylvia Plath and the life she lived and what she went through, all that came back. And I'll be very happy to deliver this lecture and put her to sleep once more. So not a lecture, really, a talk. So let me come to Sylvia Plath. Uh, Her dates are 1932 to 1963. She was born on the 27th of October, 1932, and she died on the 11th of February, 1963. So she was barely 30, barely 30. And well, a tragic waste of a life. That is what comes to mind when you hear a story like this. When we read Sylvia Plath, there are a few things that we need to keep in mind. And without knowing these facts, we cannot really understand her poetry uh, fully. In the first place, she is often called a confessional poet. What is a confessional poet? We'll come to that. So she's often called a confessional poet. What influenced her a lot was, in the first place, the death of her father. The death of her father. Secondly, the separation from her husband towards the end of her life, the last 9 months of her life. Very symbolic, the 9 months. We can talk about that also. She was separated from her husband. And the third thing that one needs to keep in mind is that she was fascinated by the idea of death and self-destruction. Death and self-destruction. So these are three things that strike us when we look at the poetry of Sylvia Plath. She married Ted Hughes. Ted Hughes, the poet laureate of England. And they were, of course, very ecstatically happy in the beginning, but then there was trouble in paradise and it didn't end too happily. As far as her works are concerned, in 1956, she brought out the first collection, which was called The Colossus. The Colossus. And like all first attempts, first publications, this is an apprentice work, you can say. She talks about nature, she talks about the clouds, she talks about animals, she talks about everything that is nice and pretty. She talks about her children, the nursery that is very pretty and so on. So that is the kind of poetry she wrote at the beginning, and she labored over it. We are told that she would sit with a thesaurus and she would be chewing her pencil with a thesaurus, and then she would circle all the words that really moved her, and then she would use those words in her poem. So she wrote very, very laboriously then. And then she broke it up. I mean, her poems were in stanza form, in rhyme, there was rhythm, and so on. So, on the whole, it was very self conscious poetry. It wasn't that spontaneous kind that she wrote later on. And later, much later, when she had to talk about her early work, she said, "Oh, my first work, The Colossus, that was about nature and the blue sky and insects and birds and so on. The kind of subject, the kind of subject that one writes who does not have any inner experience." So obviously she was young, she was still very young, and well, she did have some experience in emotional traumas and so on, but she did not, she felt, looking back, she felt she did not have that inner experience to write the kind of poetry that she wrote later on. The last collection that came out, which was posthumous, that was Ariel. Ariel came out in 1963 after she died, and it has all the poems that she wrote in the last 9 months of her life when she was separated from her husband. And they are way different from the early poems. Much after that, there were two collections published, poems that were written in between the Colossus and Ariel. And the titles are Crossing the Water and Crossing the Water and 1 minute, I had it out here. Yeah, so we have, okay, so these are the works of Sylvia Plath. We have Ariel, and we have the collected poems which came out much later. They came out in the 80s, I think. You have the Colossus, you have Crossing the Water, and you have the Bell Jar, which was a novel. So it was a novel, and it talked about her personal experiences of, well, of mental breakdown and visit to the asylum and so on, recovery. In 1963, January, she died in February. In January, her book, The Bell Jar, came out. The Bell Jar came out in 1963, and it came out under a pseudonym. So she did not use her own name, probably because she, well, for various reasons, the reasons why we do not want to put our name to something that may hurt other people or something which is too autobiographical. So she wrote it under the pseudonym of Victoria Lucas. Victoria Lucas. And there is this character called Esther Greenwood, who's very much Sylvia Plath incarnate. Now, it did not get very good reviews, and so Sylvia Plath kind of dismissed it. She said, "Oh, that's just a pot boiler." In one of her letters to her mother, she said, "Oh, that's just a pot boiler," and she dismissed it. But obviously, it must have impacted her, it must have depressed her. And coupled with the separation from her husband, and coupled with the fact that it was a very, very cold and dreary winter that London experienced that year. So everything put together, and plus looking after two little babies, one was just 9 months old and the daughter was 2 years old. So all that took its toll on her and led to her final breakdown. Now, coming back to the first collection of poems, The Colossus. So coming back to the Colossus, which was published in 1956, the Colossus, what does it bring to our mind? It reminds us of the Colossus of Rhodes, and we are reminded of those lines which are so well known from Julius Caesar. "Why, man, he doth bestride this narrow world like a Colossus, and we petty men walk about his huge legs," or whatever, "and find ourselves dishonorable graves." So the Colossus of Rhodes. So that's the picture that comes to our mind. When she talks about the Colossus, what does she have in mind? She has in mind her father. Her father was, I must tell you a little bit about him. Her father was of German descent. He came from a place called Grabow, Grabow, Grabow. And her mother was partly Austrian, partly Austrian. So they met while they were students, and well, they got married. And he was an entomologist. He was an expert in beekeeping. So he was doing research in beekeeping. Then he was writing a book on beekeeping, his thesis, and then a chapter. And the lady, the mother, Aurelia Plath, she was very supportive. She was just a supportive spouse. While he was engrossed in his research work, in his academic career, she took care of the children. And it's very interesting. You know, when Sylvia Plath was born on the 27th of October, 1962, then Otto Plath, the father, he threw a party and he tells his guests, well, all I want now is a son 1.5 years from now. And with remarkable efficiency, Sylvia Plath's mother, exactly to the date, on the 27th of April, a year and a half later, she gave birth to Sylvia Plath's brother, Warren, right? So, well, it may be coincidence, but Aurelia Plath was a very efficient woman. And she was a strong supporter of whatever work Otto Plath did. Now, Otto Plath was stubborn. He was rigid, and he had a health issue which he would not get treated. Ultimately, it was diagnosed as diabetes, and he lost one leg because of gangrene, all because he refused to get it treated. So he lost one leg. That was sometime in August, and by October, November, he had within 6 months or so, 4 to 6 months, he had passed away. He could not survive. Sylvia Plath was then just 8 years old. So that must have been in 1940. She was 8 years old, and she thought that her father had betrayed her. Her father had deserted her. She never got over it. Aurelia Plath, meanwhile, in order to support her family, her children, she started working again, and she combined her family with her parents, and she did her best to bring up the children and keep going. So coming back to this Colossus figure, the father, the Otto Plath, who was big and, a well-built man, you have a picture of him in some of the Plath collections, in a letters home, for instance. He's standing against a blackboard, because he was also a teacher, a researcher, an academician, standing against a blackboard. And that image remained in Sylvia's mind. He grew in proportion. In her memory, he grew bigger and bigger. And that explains the Colossus figure in her poems. So we have the Colossus figure, which comes again and again in different forms. And she kept looking for a father surrogate all her life. First she felt that her grandfather had filled that gap in her life. And then she, even in the male friends that she had, she kept looking for the father figure. And when she met Ted Hughes, she felt that she had found what she was looking for. So that explains the Colossus figure, the father figure, or the man in black that appears again and again in her poems, the man in black. And with this man in black, with this Colossus, she has a very ambivalent attitude, very ambivalent feelings. On the one hand, there is this love for someone who's lost. And on the other hand, there is this, that love-hate relationship. So that is the feeling that you have when you read her poems, particularly about the man in black, about the Colossus. And the relationship that was described there is that of a master-slave relationship. There is this power politics there also. There is that bondage and slavery. I'll come to that again when we talk about the poem, The Colossus. And then from time to time, she talks about the man as the oppressor, the hunter, and a sadist. But then along with the sadism, there is also an element of masochism. We will talk about it when we read the poems. We're going to read the poems after we do a little bit more about her works. Right. Now, Sylvia Plath was drawn towards death and suicide. Why? Because when she was very young, she had experienced the death of her father. Mm. And then she couldn't get over it.
I
She was
did.
very ambitious. She was very ambitious.
अरे वाह,
And she was,
कैसे
she
ख्याल
was,
आ गया ये सारे?
has the audio on. Mm. So,
Kamlesh, please switch off your
yeah.
audio.
So she
Wait,
was
Kamlesh
very
Bhasin, please
ambitious.
switch off your audio.
review. I will see it later on. Today is my book club meeting.
Kamlesh, please switch off your audio.
So in another half an hour, I will.
Kamlesh, please switch off your audio.
It's so interesting to eat
I'll
like this. Well,
definitely.
anyway.
I
Now
will.
she was
How is
very
Mama?
ambitious.
Kamlesh, please switch off.
बिल्कुल.
So you
Kamlesh,
can do it,
please switch off.
Satish ji, you can do it
Oh,
as the host, you can do it from your side.
bye bye. Thank you.
The host can actually mute all participants. Anyway, now, when she talks about nature, for instance, in the Colossus poems, she she talks about the beauty of nature, but at the same time, she brings in a sinister element. That even though apparently it's very beautiful, yet there is something, some danger lurking somewhere, some sinister element even in those beautiful scenes that she describes. Sylvia Plath, after her suicide, she became a cult figure. Now, why did she commit suicide? For one thing, she has a history of depression, and she could not take failure. Little disappointments in college or at work, they were magnified greatly. And one summer, particularly after a very successful 1 month at New York, when she was part of a young group that was guest editing Mademoiselle, the magazine. She came back and she had nothing to look forward to because some class that she had applied for, which turned down her application. So she said that the summer seemed to be stretching before me endlessly. That is described in the bell jar. So what happened was that she was just 18. She was just 18. She could not take it. Her mother was very busy keeping the family together, keeping food on the table, and struggling with life as such. So what she did one day was that she uh, went into a little attic, into a crawl space in the attic, and she took an overdose of sleeping pills. She was found 3 days later. 3 days later, she was rushed to the hospital. She underwent electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. And when you see she had fainted in that crawl space and she had hurt her head. She had hurt her head, it left a little scar. And if you look at this picture of hers, she changed her hairstyle afterwards so that the scar would be partly hidden. Hmm? That explains it. So she was 18 when she tried to commit suicide, but then she recovered and finally she could go back to, she studied in the best of colleges. She had 15 years of straight A's, nothing less than an A grade. And then she went to England on another fellowship where she met Ted Hughes. And when she saw Ted Hughes, this was it. She felt that that gap, that sad hole in her life had been now taken care of, and they got married. They came back to America, where she taught for a year at Smith College, where she was a student, and he also tried his hand at teaching, but somehow it didn't seem to work for them. So 2 years later, they went back to England, and they decided to be full-time writers. She decided to take a back step and support Ted Hughes in his writing career. So that is how it was. And then the children came, and Ted Hughes's career was making progress. Hers was not making that kind of progress. And then at one point of time, there was a young couple that they met And Ted Hughes began a relationship with the lady. It was a Canadian poet, and he got involved with the lady, and Sylvia Plath got to know she was a very possessive, very jealous person, and they separated. But she could not cope with the separation. And there's a film actually that's been made on Sylvia. The title of the film is Sylvia. I saw it in New York some years ago, and again, well, it is very true to reality. But Sylvia Plath's daughter was very upset with it. She felt that that people were trying to dig gold out of her mother's death. Frida Hughes, the daughter, is now in Australia. She is an artist, poet, and just yesterday I was watching her recite one of her poems. She is, well, she's good, she's talented. And incidentally, the boy, that means Sylvia's son, Nicholas Farrar, he too committed suicide. So it's rather sad. I don't know, perhaps experts would tell you whether depression and dementia and suicidal tendencies run in a family or not, but this is how it happened. Sylvia Plath committed suicide, her son committed suicide. And what happened to Ted Hughes? That's very interesting. You see, he started living with that lady, Asia. Her name was Asia Webel. And they had a daughter. But that lady felt that the ghost of Sylvia Plath was haunting her. And she used to have hallucinations. And one fine day, she was found dead in exactly the same manner as Sylvia Plath. How did Sylvia Plath die? She put her head in the gas oven.
Oh, shit.
And in exactly the same manner, Asia Webel and her little daughter, they were found dead. Asia Webel could not cope with that guilt or whatever it was. And well, that's what happened. And Ted Hughes, what happened to Ted Hughes? Well, he was branded as a very cruel husband. He was branded as someone who had led to the death of his wife and then later on his girlfriend. And some people even called him a male Xanthippe. Xanthippe, you may be aware, was Socrates' wife, and she was quite a shrew. She was a very cruel woman. And Socrates, what was it that Socrates said? He said, if you are happily married, you can enjoy a happy life. But if you are not happily married, you can become a philosopher. That is what Socrates had said. So his wife Xanthippe used to be very cruel to him. And Ted Hughes was branded as a male Xanthippe. So he just clammed up. He had to look after two babies left behind by Sylvia Plath. And the one left behind by Asia, that one was dead. So he had to look after them. And so he wrote only children's verse for many years, say from 1963 till for about 30 years, he wrote only children's verse. And then what happened was he brought out a poem, he brought out a collection of poems called Birthday Letters, all of them addressed to Sylvia Plath. I remember reading about it on at the airport when I was on one of my fellowships to to Iowa State. And I was wondering, why after so many years is he digging up his wife's ghost again? It was all about Sylvia Plath, the way he had met her and their life together. And in one of the poems, he said there were certain things which are unavoidable. You and I were characters in a Greek drama. We had to play our parts. And then a few months later, Ted Hughes was dead. So he was suffering from cancer. And before dying, he wanted to, this is my reading, he wanted to kind of make amends, or he wanted to, take it out of his system. And that is why he brought out this offering for Sylvia Plath. Okay, so from Sylvia Plath, we have moved on to Ted Hughes. And We have talked about the son who sadly committed suicide. And you see, he once said, Ted Hughes said, I seem to have the touch of death about me. His wife died, his girlfriend died, and then the girlfriend's baby died. And well, later on, his son also committed suicide. So he had gone through a lot, Ted Hughes. Ted Hughes, incidentally, is also a fascinating poet, if you start reading him. And because I was into Sylvia Plath, I started reading Ted Hughes, but then I was always in Sylvia Plath's camp for obvious reasons. All right. Now, Sylvia Plath became a cult figure for all feminists because of the way she had, the way she had died, the way she had been jilted by her husband, the husband she loved very much. So she became a sort of a cult figure. And there were feminists all over the Western world, in particular, people like Robin Morgan and others who had a lot to say against Ted Hughes and who made her a sort of a goddess. A term that is often used when we talk about Sylvia Plath is bitch goddess, bitch goddess. She's a goddess, but then she's also that goddess who can be cruel. So the term bitch goddess is often used for Sylvia Plath. And we find when we look at the graph of her poems, we find that this is a little bit of academic jargon, but let me bring it here. We find that there are different stages in her poetry. She begins in a very feminine, with a very feminine stance, moves on to the feminist, and then to the female. And these three stages are those that Elaine Showalter in one of her essays has talked about. So she begins with the feminine, goes on to the feminist, and ultimately ends up as the female. That means the rebel who's ready to kill and defy and so on. Towards the end of her career, in the last few poems of the last 9 months of her life, we find that she takes on a different role altogether. For example, there's a poem called Parda, and there Parda, as you know, is the veil. So she talks about how she was like a doll, hidden, shy, and so on. But she says, well, that when the time comes, I will tear off my parda and I will kill my oppressor. This is just one example. Then we have the image of the bee. You see, she started beekeeping. She started beekeeping because she was remembering her father all the time. So beekeeping also became a hobby with her. And the bee became a symbol of freedom, of liberation. And she started allying herself. She started identifying herself with the bee that flies freely in the air, right? And yeah, in the early poems, on the contrary, the man was the homme fatale. Homme fatale, that means the fatal man, the deadly man. So in order to counter the homme fatale, which is the opposite of femme fatale, she takes on the role of the lioness, the bee, ready to kill whoever tries to oppress her. All right. Now, right at the beginning, I had talked about confessional poetry, that Sylvia Plath is often grouped with the confessional poets. Who are the confessional poets and what is confessional poetry? For that, I'll have to talk about a little bit about the other poets who were writing around that time. The term confessional calls to mind what? What does it bring to mind? It brings to mind something that is personal, something that is autobiographical. When you lay your heart out before someone, when you confess a crime or something wrong that you have done. It is like the confessions that people have in churches, when you go to a father confessor, or you have the confessions of, say, St. Augustine or Rousseau or De Quincey, or one of those confessions that we have read about. Confessional poetry, the term confessional was added to poetry sometime in the middle of the 20th century when Robert Lowell, the American poet Robert Lowell, brought out his collection of poems called Life Studies. Life Studies. That was in 1959. And then there was this critic called Rosenthal, M.L. Rosenthal. He read the poems and he says, well, this is the confessional school of poetry. And Robert Lowell used to take poetry classes, which Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton, another poet, a friend of Sylvia Plath. So Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton used to, and there was another person with them, George Starbuck. They used to audit Robert Lowell's poetry classes and they picked up his style of writing. And then after class, sometimes they would go to a pub, they would sit together and have drinks and then generally talk about poetry and talk about death and suicide. Why did they talk about death and suicide? Because Anne Sexton too had that bent of mind. She was also drawn towards such subjects. And in one of her poems, which she calls the Why poem, she says, we were like carpenters, and carpenters never ask why build. They just ask what tools. We talked about death, and that was life for us. So they would talk about different ways of killing themselves. I know it sounds morbid, it is bizarre, it is depressing, but that is the kind of conversation that they used to have. And she says, Anne Sexton says, we were like moths drawn to an electric light bulb, that was death, sucking on it. Well, sadly, that was the case. So this is what they were great friends, and they used to talk about death, and they used to talk about death in their poems and about ways of committing suicide and so on. And these confessional poets are sometimes called the Suicide Squad or the Madhouse Muses. Why Madhouse? I'll tell you that also, because self-destruction is such an important ingredient in their poems. And all of them had a brush with mental illness. Robert Lowell had a brush with mental illness, and he talked about his experiences. So did Anne Sexton. Anne Sexton has a collection of poems called To Bedlam and Part Way Back. To Bedlam and Part Way Back, Anne Sexton. So Part Way Back, never recovered fully as such. And Sylvia Plath herself, she had a nervous breakdown. She had to undergo electroconvulsive therapy. And well, they were all of the same kind. Then another poet who was sometimes clubbed with the confessional poets is Theodore Roethke, a nature poet who's written some excellent poems, but he has a lot in common with these poets. So generally, these poets are clubbed together, and sometimes W.D. Snodgrass is also with them, and not Ted Hughes, even though he came under Sylvia Plath's influence a little. Another characteristic of these confessional poets was their interest in mental health, in insanity. So they talked about their mental breakdown, suicide, yes, mental breakdown, yes, and it was nothing to be ashamed of, nothing to be embarrassed about. Normally, you know, when we have a problem like this, we try to push it under the carpet. We don't talk about it, but they talked about it in very glorifying terms. In fact, Roethke said, "What's madness? What's madness but nobility of soul at odds with circumstance? What's madness but nobility of soul at odds with circumstance?" So they talked about their madness, and they were not embarrassed. They were not shy about it. What else did they talk about? They talked about father fixation. All of them talked about, they seemed to be obsessed with their fathers, and their fathers were dominating personalities in their lives. Robert Lowell talked about his father's failures and so on. Sylvia Plath talked about the way the father has deserted her and how he haunts her. Anne Sexton talked about the father getting drunk and, you know, his beer belly, and in not very nice terms, in a rather lecherous picture that she presents of him. So there is that father fixation. And John Berryman is another poet who talks about the loss of his father and loss of his brothers and so on. Then they also talk about failures. Failures, again, a subject that we would not like to share with the world, but they talk about their failures, how their disappointments in life, and so on. Also about their state of health, their diseases. A cut thumb, for instance, a cut thumb becomes something that Sylvia Plath writes a poem about. So she looks at her thumb, it's been cut. She says, what a thrill, my thumb instead of an onion. So instead of the onion, she's cut her thumb. Anne Sexton she writes about her uterus. She writes an ode to her uterus. She writes, and then these subjects that they talk about, they are anything but poetic in the traditional sense. She has a poem, Anne Sexton has a poem on the breaking of waters, just before she's about to deliver a child. She talks about how, the waters break. And then she talks about, she has a poem that has a strange title, Ballad of the Lonely Masturbator. So there is nothing unpoetic as such. Everything comes into their poems. Nothing is unpoetic. There is a lot of autobiographical fact, but there is a tinkering with fact. There is a tinkering with fact. It's not given as just life history. So you change a little bit, and that's what these poets try to do. From the personal, they tried to move a little towards the public by bringing in, say, images from mythology and images from the outer world, not just the inner space. Okay, so this was about Sylvia Plath, the background and some of the characteristics of the work, which we will be referring to again when we look at the poems. So would you like me to read some of the poems? Mohini ji, would you like?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
We begin with the Colossus. Is it clear here?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So we begin with the Colossus. And here, I wish I had thought of bringing you a picture of Gulliver in the land of Lilliputians. But I'm sure you can recall it from comic books and pictures that you may have seen. The huge Gulliver and little men crawling all over Gulliver, crawling over his hands, his nostrils, his whole body. So the Colossus out here is a huge statue that is fallen, and you have a tiny woman that is trying to put it together, trying to piece it together, trying to keep it neat and clean and so on. I shall never get you put together entirely, pieced, glued, and properly jointed. Mule bray, pig grunt, and body cackles proceed from your great lips. It's worse than a barnyard. Perhaps you consider yourself an oracle, mouthpiece of the dead, or of some god or other. 30 years now I have labored to dredge the silt from your throat. I am none the wiser. Actually, this poem was written before she was 30, but 30 becomes a sort of a magical figure. And we'll come across this phrase 30 years again in a later poem too. So what is she like? She's a tiny creature, scaling little ladders with glue pots and pails of Lysol. I crawl like an ant in morning over the weedy acres of your brow to mend the immense skull plates and clear the bald white tumuli of your eyes. A blue sky out of the Orestia arches above us. So there is a reference here to the Orestia. There's a reference to Electra, to Agamemnon, and to Greek mythology. So from the personal, she's trying to move to mythology, which is in the public sphere. Oh, Father, all by yourself, you are pithy and historical as the Roman Forum, as the Colosseum in Rome. I opened my lunch on a hill of black cypress. Your fluted bones and ascentine hair are littered in their old anarchy to the horizon line. It would take more than a lightning stroke to create such a ruin. Nights, I squat in the cornucopia of your left ear out of the wind, counting the red stars and those of plum color. The sun rises under the pillar of your tongue. My hours are married to shadow. No longer do I listen for the scrape of a keel on the blank stones of the landing. See, towards the end, there is that note of finality, of despair, that nothing will change. I am doomed. This is what I will keep on doing for the rest of my life, trying to put this statue together. And the statue is that of her. The colossus is a symbol of her father. She will never be able to get out of the shadow of the father. Can I move on to the next poem? Yeah? Lady Lazarus. Lady Lazarus. Lazarus, we know, is a biblical character who was brought back to life. Now, we have Sylvia Plath who's talking about the Colossus, incidentally, which I just read, was written in 1956, and this one was written in the last 9 months of her life. That means towards the end of 1962. And you can see how the poem, the format, the structure of the poem has changed, and even the the rhythms and the rhymes that she uses, that also changes. This becomes more racy. And in fact, all of her poems towards the last phase of her life were written like urgent letters, urgent letters. And here she's talking about her suicide. She's talking about, she's comparing herself with a cat. A cat has 9 lives. Every 10 years, it has to die. And I am just in the 3rd life. So she's talking about her suicide attempts. I've done it again. See the note of exultation in the beginning. I've done it again. 1 year in every 10, I manage it. A sort of a walking miracle. My skin bright as a Nazi lampshade. My right foot a paperweight. My face a featureless fine Jew linen. The reference is to the atrocities committed by the Nazis. They used to use the skin. It is believed that they used to use the skin of the Jews to make lampshades out of them. And so she says that I've done it again. I am a sort of a walking miracle. My skin bright as a Nazi lampshade. My right foot a paperweight. My face a featureless fine Jew linen. Note, she talks about 1 foot, my right foot. Her father had 1 foot. The other had been amputated. So my right foot a paperweight, my face a featureless fine Jew linen. Peel off the napkin, oh my enemy, do I terrify? The nose, the eye pits, the full set of teeth, the sour breath will vanish in a day. Soon, soon the flesh the grave cave ate will be at home on me, and I a smiling woman. Well, I am dead. Right now you can see only my bones, the eye pits, the nose, and so on. But very soon the skin will come back again and I will be a smiling woman again. I am only 30, and like a cat, I have 9 times to die. This is number 3. What a trash to annihilate each decade. What a million filaments. The peanut crunching crowd shoves in to see them unwrap me hand and foot. The big striptease. Now, this peanut crunching crowd that Sylvia Plath mentions so contemptuously, they are the people who come and, they are the ones who love something sensational. Oh, they come to watch the fun. They come to see the drama that's taking place. Ah, she's come back to life. Oh, she's tried to kill herself again. The peanut crunching crowd, they're not involved. They're not empathetic. They are casual, they're peanut crunching. And this peanut crunching crowd is what Sylvia Plath's daughter talks about in her poems. You must read, what's her name, Frida Hughes's poems. She talks about the peanut crunching crowd, which is trying to dig gold out of her mother's death. So they shoves in to see them unwrap me. You see the voyeuristic interest that people take in somebody else's tragedy. So they come to see them unwrap me hand and foot, the big striptease. Gentlemen, ladies, these are my hands, my knees. I may be skin and bone, nevertheless, I'm the same identical woman. The first time it happened, I was 10. It was an accident. No, actually, she was 8 when her father died. But in the myth that she weaves, this she has to, she has to talk in terms of tens, a decade, then another, and so on. So I was 10 when it happened. It was an accident. The second time I meant to last it out and not come back at all. I rocked shut as a seashell. The second time, when she tried to commit suicide in the crawl space, they had to call and pick the worms off me like sticky pearls. And these lines are very well known. Dying is an art like everything else. I do it exceptionally well. I do it so it feels like hell. I do it so it feels real. I guess you could say I have a call. There's irony in this line. I guess you could say I have a call. So people have different kind of a call. Some have a call to become a mystic or turn to spirituality, turn to God. She has this call. It's easy enough to do it in a cell. It's easy enough to do it and stay put. It is the theatrical comeback in broad day to the same place, the same face, the same brute amused shout, a miracle that knocks me out. There is a charge. There is a charge for the eyeing of my scars. There is a charge for the hearing of my heart. It really goes. And there is a charge, a very large charge for a word or a touch or a bit of blood or a piece of my hair or my clothes. So, Herr Doctor, Herr Enemy, I am your opus. I am your valuable, the pure gold baby that melts to a shriek. I turn and burn. Do not think I underestimate your great concern. Ash, ash, you poke and stir. Flesh, bone, there's nothing there. A cake of soap, a wedding ring, a gold filling. Herr God, Herr Lucifer, beware, beware. Out of the ash I rise with my red hair and I eat men like air. So she is like the phoenix that comes back to life again and again from the ashes. And she says, there's a warning out here, I eat men like air. So this is the final phase in which she drops that docile image that she has been, that she started with. And she says, out of the ash I rise with my red hair and I eat men like air. Another poem that is very well known, Ariel. Ariel. And this poem is actually describes an experience when she was on a horse. The horse was called Ariel. She went riding and the horse bolted. She hung on the horse's head, her neck, and she came back very, very frightened. So the whole poem, I will not read all of it, but it describes it describes the ride. It describes a ride. It is very racy, and there are images that flash before our eyes, images which have some kind of a cinematic impression. And towards the end, she says, I am the arrow, the dew that flies suicidal at one with the drive into the red eye cauldron of morning. So there is that image of self-destruction in this poem. And now we come to perhaps the most famous of Sylvia Plath's poems, which is Daddy. Daddy. You can see the rhythm, the rhyme in this, and you can see the spontaneity also. Daddy. You do not do any more black shoe in which I have lived like a foot for 30 years, poor and white, barely daring to breathe or chew. The words remind us of a nursery rhyme. There was an old woman who lived in a shoe. She had so many children, she didn't know what to do. So the words remind us of a nursery rhyme, but the poem is anything but a child's poem, a children's poem. And then she says, you see what she says about this poem is significant. She says this poem is uttered by a girl with an Electra complex. Her father died when she still thought him to be a god. So you can see the autobiographical connection. Her case is further complicated by the fact that her father was partly German and her mother was partly Jewish. And in the girl, the two strains marry each other. So that explains the contradictions we have in this poem. It explains the ambivalence of attitude towards daddy. Daddy, I've had to kill you. You died before I had time. Marble heavy, a bag full of God, ghastly statue with one grey toe. One grey toe. Otto Plath had one leg, one toe. Ghastly statue with one grey toe, big as a Frisco seal, and a head in the freakish Atlantic, where it pours bean green over blue in the waters of beautiful Nauset. I used to pray to recover you. I used to pray to recover you. Ach du, ach du. So she's using German words out here. So she's using German words, and the images that we have of the Atlantic, those images are taken from her childhood, which was spent by the seaside. Nauset is a seaside place in Massachusetts. In the German tongue, in the Polish town, scraped flat by the roller of wars. But the name of the town is common. My Polack friend says there's a dozen or two of them, so I never could tell where you put your foot, your root. I never could talk to you. The tongue stuck in my jaw. It stuck in a barbed wire snare. Ick, 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 ick. Ick, ick, ick. Or maybe it's ish, I don't know, it's German. Ish, yes, it's ish. Ish, ish. I could hardly speak. I thought every German was you and the language obscene. An engine chuffing me off like a Jew to Dachau, Auschwitz, Belsen. I began to talk like a Jew. I think I may well be a Jew. So she is identifying herself with the Jews and identifying her father with a Nazi. The snows of Tyrol, the clear beer of Vienna are not very pure or true. With my gypsy ancestors and my weird luck and my tarot pack, I may be a bit of a Jew. I've always been scared of you with your Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. With your Luftwaffe, your gobbledygoo, your neat mustache and your Aryan eye, bright blue, Panzerman. See, we almost get a picture of Adolf Hitler out here. Huh? Your gobbledygoo and your neat mustache and your Aryan eye, bright blue, Panzerman, the German army. Oh, you, not God, but a swastika so black, no sky could squeak through. And the lines that follow are significant. Every woman adores a fascist, the boot in the face, the brute heart of a brute like you. So this is what I mentioned earlier, that you have this masochistic tone in her poems, the ambivalence towards the father. And then the picture of the father standing against the blackboard. You stand at the blackboard, Daddy, in the picture I have of you. A cleft in your chin instead of your foot. A cleft in your chin instead of your foot, but no less a devil for that. No, not any less the black man who bit my pretty red heart in two. I was 10 when they buried you. At 20, I tried to die and get back to you. I thought even the bones would do. But they pulled me out of the sack and they stuck me together with glue. And then I knew what to do. I made a model of you, a man in black with a Mein Kampf look and a love of the rack and the screw. She's talking about Ted Hughes. So from the father, the man in black moves to the husband. The image moves to the husband. A man in black with a Mein Kampf look and a love of the rack and the screw. And I said, I do. I married him. So, Daddy, I'm finally through. The black telephone's off at the root. The voices just can't worm through. And the last two stanzas became very controversial. If I've killed one man, I've killed two. So symbolically, she has, you see, she is possessed by the father, and this is how she describes the poem, that this is by a girl who has an Electra complex, and she has to symbolically kill the father before she is free of his shadow. So she has to act out the awful little allegory before she gets free of it. If I've killed one man, I've killed two. The vampire who said he was you and drank my blood for a year. 7 years, if you want to know. She was married to Ted Hughes for 7 years. 7 years, if you want to know. Daddy, you can lie back now. There's a stake in your fat black heart, and the villagers never liked you. They are dancing and stamping on you. They always knew it was you. Daddy, Daddy, you bastard, I'm through. The last line is what became the most controversial. And of course, it was picked up by a lot of feminists, including a woman called Diane Wachowski, who brought out a collection of poems. The title of the book was Dancing on the Grave of a Son of a Bitch. Dancing on the Grave of a Son of a Bitch. And it was dedicated, she said, Diane Wachowski, it was dedicated to all my motorcycle lovers in the hope that they fall off their motorcycles and break their necks. And Dancing on the Grave of a Son of a Bitch is clearly inspired by Sylvia Plath's poem, Dancing and Stamping on the Father's Grave. Okay, so this was Daddy, and then there is one poem that she writes about fever. She had fever once, and she imagines herself rising to heaven. Rising to heaven. I'm not reading this poem. But again, she imagines herself going up, attended by cherubim and so on, going to paradise. This poem, Edge, is important because she is imagining herself dead. Imagining herself dead, and her children also dead at her, lying at her breast. And then this last one, words. Words are generally taken as, actually Edge was her almost last poem, but words this poem seems to be a sort of an epitaph for her. And I'm drawing your attention to the last stanza. Words dry and riderless, the indefatigable hoof taps, while from the bottom of the pool, fixed stars govern a life. She and Ted Hughes were also interested in astrology for some time. So in this, she's talking about her journey from creativity to despair, from despair to death. The last poem that I have here is interesting because it talks about, the role that a woman is required to play in a marriage. This is not the complete poem. This is, I've just taken out a few lines. And here you have a salesperson who's interviewing a man who is applied to buy a wife. Let me repeat, a man has applied to buy a wife. And a salesman is talking to him. He says, are you a sort of a person? Open your hand, empty, empty. Here is a hand to fill it and willing to bring teacups and roll away headaches and do whatever you tell it. Will you marry it? It is guaranteed to thumb shut your eyes at the end and dissolve of sorrow. Now your head, excuse me, it is empty. I have a ticket for that. Come here, sweetie, out of the closet. Well, what do you think of that? Naked as paper to start. But in 25 years, she'll be silver. In 50, she'll be gold. A living doll everywhere you look. It can sew, it can cook, it can talk, talk, talk. It works, there's nothing wrong with it. You have a hole, it's a poultice. You have an eye, it's an image. My boy, it's your last resort. Will you marry it, marry it, marry it? Reading Sylvia Plath can be an exhausting exercise. I will not read anymore.